All right, so we're in Zechariah 6 out of the visions of Zechariah in this book. Chapter 6 ends the series of introductory visions in this book. And so we'll transition to a little bit different type of teaching style in next week when we get to chapter 7. So we come to the last of the visions. This one is simple and yet probably the most difficult and the most simple at the same time out of all of these visions. And we're going to be covering just one chapter this morning. I've been trying to do two most of the time. It's only 15 verses, so it's a shorter one. But there's sort of two real distinct different type of sections here in chapter 6. So we're going to cover vision with 4 chariots that are in it. And then we're going to cover a prophetic act that Zechariah does. I say Ezekiel because he had all kinds of prophetic acts, but a prophetic act of Zechariah to proclaim the nature of the coming of the Messiah. So let's begin with verses 1 through 3 of Zechariah chapter 6. I feel like I'm going to have to shout with how the rain coming down. Man. Now I lifted up my eyes and looked, and behold, 4 chariots were coming forth between 2 mountains, and the mountains were bronze mountains. With the first chariot were red horses, with the second chariot black horses, with the third chariot white horses, and with the fourth chariot strong dappled horses. So once again, Zechariah has a vision of horses. Once again, it's a vision of horses of different colors. And once again, as we're going to see, we do not know why these horses are different colors. So some things line up very well with Zechariah's vision. One thing I don't think we can do, though, is have a holdover in meaning between the horses in Zechariah 1 and the horses in Zechariah 2. It seems like there's too many disconnects to say that there's any pattern with the fact that he's using colored horses in both ones. But basically what Zechariah is saying is a very simple vision. It's a vision of 4 chariots. So this is chariots pulled by horses, and they is sort of a kind of terrific rush of energy as these chariots are coming forth between the mountains. So we can almost get a picture of them rushing through a valley between 2 mountains. These mountains are described as bronze, which probably is not a picture of the fact that these are actually like metal bronze covered mountains, but they probably have a sandy, rocky face to them. So a look in that way. And each of the chariots are pulled by horses of different colors. So we have one chariot being pulled by red horses, another chariot being pulled by black horses, a third chariot being pulled by white horses, and the final chariot being pulled by strong, dappled, or painted horses. So Zechariah just basically says, I have this vision of 4 chariots just racing down this valley. They're going at a terrifying gallop. The horses are pulled. The chariots are pulled by horses of different colors, and that's the vision. So these horses racing through the mountain, and then the question is why, and we get the why in verses 4 through 8 of Zechariah 6. Then I spoke and said to the angel who was speaking with me, what are these, my Lord? The angel replied to me, these are the 4 spirits of heaven, going forth after standing before the Lord of all the earth, with one of which the black horses are going forth to the north country, and the white ones go forth after them, while the dappled ones go forth to the south country. When the strong ones went out, they were eager to go to patrol the earth. And he said, go, patrol the earth. So they patrolled the earth. Then he cried out to me and spoke to me, saying, see, those who are going to the land of the north have appeased my wrath in the land of the north. So again, we have one of these visions with colored horses. And again, the colors aren't explained. We aren't told what they mean. And then second, we have these mountains, which again, we said were bronze mountains, probably signifying the rocky color of them for the area of Judah. But again, we don't know why they're called bronze mountains. That's not answered for us as well. because of the location of where Zechariah is located, and them being in the area of Judah and in Jerusalem. We can probably guess that he's getting a vision of two mountains that are in the area of Jerusalem with a valley between them. So my guess is that the location of this vision is probably supposed to be the Valley of Jehoshaphat. So the Valley of Jehoshaphat is the valley that rests between the mount where Jerusalem sits, Mount Zion, and then you have a valley, and then up that valley on the top of that is the Mount of Olives. And when I was there, I kind of thought it was kind of comical that they're actually called mountains. They're more like kind of like big hills. Although compared to New Orleans, they're definitely mountains. So you got these two mountains on either side, the Mount of Olives, Jerusalem. In between those two is a valley known as the Valley of Jehoshaphat. That's probably the most likely location thinking about the area of Jerusalem. So, and if you look at those mountainsides, they are kind of stony, and in a sunset, they would probably have a bronze look to them. So that kind of fits with it as well, if that's what we're going for. And then Zechariah is told that these chariots, these horses that are going through are the four spirits, the four angels of heaven. When it comes to the word for spirit, or the word for wind in Hebrew, it's all the same word. This is the four ruach of heaven, and ruach is a word that means spirit, wind, or breath. So these could be the four spirits of heaven, or it could also be the four winds of heaven. It seems that most Bible translators translate this as the four spirits going forth from heaven. And then if you look at most commentators, they say it's the four winds of heaven going forth. I don't think it makes all that much of a difference. The biggest difference is that if you're going to go with wind, that's an image of God's power going forth from God's presence in places of the Old Testament. And so we'll get to the point of why most commentators end up actually going with wind when we get to the end of this explanation. But here's where this prophecy gets really sort of weird. And that is, we read about the four spirits or the four winds going forth from heaven. And the use of four spirits, four winds, if we look at other places where that's used, that usually has the idea of these are winds that are going to cover all of the earth. The four has to deal with going to the four corners of the earth, saying it's going to cover and go across the whole globe. So when we read about these winds going forth, and we have the number 4, our expectation is that when they're sent forth, one's going to go to the north, one's going to go to the south, one's going to go to the east, one's going to go to the west, and they're going to cover the entire world. But then what do we see when they go forth? We have one going to the north, and then another one follows it to the north. And so we have 2 of them going to the north, and then we have the white ones that are going down toward the south. And then the real interesting thing is then we have one of the 4 out of the colors, which is the red horses in that chariot. They aren't even mentioned. So we have 2 going north, 1 going south, and the 4th one doesn't even come up. And so the question is like, what are we getting here? This is just kind of, this is not expected. This seems kind of bizarre. And the thing about it is that we're not told why we have 2 to the north and 1 to the south. And so we do have to theorize a little bit about what's going on here. And so here's my theory. I'm trying to make it clear with big asterisks that yes, the angel is not telling us these details, but this is the best we can get from this information that we have here. And that are, first, the chariots aren't traveling to simply patrol and observe, but that these angels are going forth to judge. They're going forth north and south in judgment. The reason that I say they're going north and south in judgment is that we see at the end of the explanation is that what is the result of these chariots going forth is that we read is that the result is the wrath of God has been appeased. In other words, God's wrath has been expelled. God has brought forth the judgment, and so now God's wrath can rest. He doesn't need to be wrathful anymore because these angels took care of the judgment that God brought forth. So we read about two going to the north and one going to the south. And the angels going to the north, I'm going to tie this with what we just saw in the previous vision. If you remember a couple of weeks ago in the previous vision, we saw odd vision of a woman being placed in a basket, that woman representing the iniquity of the land. And where was that basket taken? But it was taken to the land of Shinar, which is the land of Babel or Babylon. And I know that if you were to look on a map, you would be like, oh, Babylon isn't to the north, though. That's to the east of Judah. But if you're going to travel to Babylon, you can't go straight east to Babylon because you're going to go through a desert and you'll all die of thirst on the way there. So if you're going to go to Babylon, you still have to go north and then east. So even though Babylon is to the east, when people talked about traveling to Babylon just colloquially, they would say, I'm going to go to the north to go to Babylon, because you would need to go north before you would go east. So I think tying it with the visions before, what we see is the winds of God going forth to bring judgment upon Babylon, upon the area of Babel. And then we have one going to the south, which is probably a picture of bringing judgment upon Egypt one last time. And again, we can't say why the fourth chariot isn't mentioned. So the question is, when did this occur, or when will this occur? Have we had a time in history where judgment has gone forth from the Jerusalem area to bring judgment upon forces from Babylon, while at the same time bringing forces upon those from Egypt? If you know basics of history, you would say such a thing has never happened. In fact, because from Zechariah's time onward, Babylon has not been a nation worth dealing with at all. Babylon's been either under the thumb of Persian or other nations, and it's never been, there's never been a reason to battle with them at all from the perspective of Israel. And then also judgment's never gone from Israel into Egypt either. So this is something that we're getting a picture of judgment coming from Jerusalem to the north and then to the south, and it's something that has never happened before. It's something that's never occurred in all of history, so that means it's something that's still future from our own perspective. So then the question is, when will this happen? Well, I think that we are intended to take the vision that we have here in the first half of Zechariah 6, and then to pair it with the prophetic act that Zechariah is about to do in the second half of Zechariah 6. So these two sections, I think, are supposed to go together. There's a lot of times where I get really frustrated about chapter divisions in the Bible and about where they divided them off. I think this is one place where we have a good chapter division, because I do think all of Zechariah 6 is meant to go together. And what we'll see, not giving away the end of Zechariah 6, because we're going to look at that in just a moment. But the second half of Zechariah 6, that prophetic act that Zechariah does is all about the character and the role of the coming Messiah. So we have a messianic prophecy in the second half of Zechariah 6. So what I believe the first half of Zechariah 6 is meant to do is it's meant to picture what's going to happen right before the coming of the Messiah. So Zechariah chapter 6 is meant to show this is what's going to happen on the world scene right before the Messiah comes and rules over his people as the king priest of the Jews. And so we can now look from our own perspective and what do we know from Revelation and what John says is going to happen right before Jesus rules and reigns in Jerusalem. But the event right before the reigning of Christ is going to be the Battle of Armageddon. And if we take what happens in Armageddon at the coming of Christ and we put this together with the vision in the first half of Zechariah 6, they actually fit pretty well together, with the Antichrist bringing forces from the north and the south upon Jerusalem to attack it. A larger coalition of forces are going to come from the north, when we look at the nations that are going to come in a line with the Antichrist. So it makes sense that you would have 2 chariots go to the north, 1 chariot go to the south. And so what we have in Zechariah chapter 6 is really our first really vision of Armageddon that's coming. I also think that Zechariah alluded to Armageddon earlier in this book as well. So this also goes well with something that's sort of been a theme that Zechariah has been doing, and that is right before the Messiah comes, right before he rules and reigns on earth, what we're going to need to have is a massive battle where the wrath and the judgment of God goes first and then is sort of appeased and is able to rest following that time of wrath. And so we see that picture of that judgment in the first half of Zechariah chapter 6. And now that we have that image of what's going to happen right before the Messiah comes, now we're going to have what I would consider to be a living illustration of the Messiah in verses 9 through 15. So let's look now at Zechariah chapter 6, verses 9 through 15. The word of the Lord also came to me, saying, take an offering from the exiles, from Heldai, Tobijah, and Jedediah. I love it when names come up in the Bible that don't come up in any other place, and you're like, and you go the same day and enter the house of Josiah the son of Zephaniah, where they have arrived from Babylon. Take silver and gold, make an ornate crown, and set it on the head of Joshua the son of Jehozadak, the high priest. Then say to him, thus says the Lord of hosts, behold, a man whose name is Branch, for he will branch out from where he is, and he will build the temple of the Lord. Yes, it is he who will build the temple of the Lord, and he who will bear the honor and sit and rule on his throne. Thus he will be a priest on his throne, and the council of peace will be between the 2 offices. Now the crown will become a reminder in the temple of the Lord to Helam, Tobijah, Jediah, and Hen, the son of Zephaniah. Those who are far off will come and build the temple of the Lord. Then you will know that the Lord of hosts has sent me to you, and it will take place if you completely obey the Lord your God. So we see here we have 3 exiles returning from Babylon or Persia with an offer for the temple. We don't know anything about these 3 individuals outside of this one mention in the Bible, but we read that these 3 men come, and they come with an offering of silver and gold. And following the Lord's instructions, Zechariah just barges right into the house where they are staying. So he barges into this house where these guys are staying while they're in the area, and Zechariah takes their silver and gold that they've brought for a donation to the temple. But instead of using that silver and gold as a donation for the temple, Zechariah takes these precious materials and he uses them to turn them into a crown. And let's pause for a moment right there and let's appreciate this illustration of the Lord. Because the whole point of this book so far has been to encourage Zerubbabel and Joshua the high priest in their work in building the second temple. The whole point of Zechariah and the book Haggai before this is to encourage them to build God's temple. Even though it looks like it's not going to be fantastic, it's not going to be nearly as grand or beautiful as the Temple of Solomon, they need to continue in that work. Even though it may seem like they don't have enough supplies to finish that work, continue in that work. So it's all saying, I know you're impoverished. I know you don't feel significant in the grand scheme of the world, but you guys need to continue to be faithful to the Lord, no matter how small this work may be. So that's the whole point of these 2 books, is to encourage the leaders along in the building of the temple of the Lord. So in the midst of this time, 3 Jews show up from Persia or Babylon with this financial offering of gold and silver to build the temple. And I mean, really, from one perspective, what an awesome picture of God's deliverance to allow them to have the resources they need to build the temple. I mean, that gold and silver could probably be used in some way to build to fashion some of the articles that are needed for the inside of the temple itself. Or if they already got all that taken care of, if they have the gold and the silver that they need, at the minimum, it can be sold to purchase other goods and other materials that they need for the temple. I mean, when they show up, it was probably, oh, praise the Lord for this financial gift to help with the building of the temple. Yet the Lord comes and says to Zechariah, I want you to take that silver and gold, and I don't want you to use it in the construction of the temple. I want you to use that silver and gold to make a crown. And you know what? This crown that you're going to make, it will not even be worn on a regular basis. This crown is simply going to be used as a symbol for someone who will wear this crown one day in the future. And one of the things I kind of love about this illustration is that, and to use sort of modern millennial language, this is almost like the greatest flex move from the Lord. This is a move of boldness and confidence where the Lord can say, I am so confident that this temple is going to be made, that when someone shows up with an offering of gold and silver to complete that temple, the Lord can say, you don't even need to use it for the temple. I got another plan for this gold and silver. The Lord is just taking complete confidence that he can use this gold and silver to make a crown that will be a symbol of his coming king. And so in one way, from the perspective of Joshua and Zerubbabel, making this crown is an illustration of the Lord's ability to provide for his people. The Lord is so confident in his own provisions that this temple will be able to be completed, that he can take what seems to be a crucial donation and then use it as a sign for his coming king. So then the question is, what is this sign? What is the purpose of this crown? Well, Zechariah takes this gold and silver. He has it made into a crown. Scholars say probably the most likely image to think of is he probably took a gold band and made that as a crown, a silver band and made that as a crown, and then had the two crowns sort of melded together into one crown that would be worn. And you'll see as we go on why we'll take this idea of two crowns being turned into one. But Zechariah takes this crown of gold and silver and he places it on the head. You would assume at this point, if you know the history, there should be only one person that's going to get this crown put on their head, and that is Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel is the governor, the political leader of Judah. Not only is Zerubbabel the political leader of Judah, but Zerubbabel is also in the line of the Messiah. Zerubbabel is a son of David. And so all of the anticipation should be Zechariah is going to put this crown on Zerubbabel's head. He doesn't do that. He goes in and he puts the crown on Joshua's head, on the head of the high priest. And then when he does this, he says these words. He says, behold, a man whose name is Branch. And the wording that's on here is, and it's subtle, but it's clear at the same time in the Hebrew. And that is, he is not saying, behold, Joshua, you are the branch. He's not saying that. He's saying, behold, a man whose name is Branch. In other words, there will be someone else who will be the branch. Behold, I am talking about the branch, but sorry, Joshua, you're not the branch. You're just a symbol of the branch to come. So that's the pronouns that are used here are pretty clear that that's the way, and the articles are pretty clear that that's the way Zechariah is speaking, is that there will be a man whose name is Branch, but that is not Joshua. And the significance of the title Branch comes up from earlier in Jeremiah, and the branch is a title for the Messiah. or the Christ. So he's saying that behold, there's a man whose name is Branch, who is the Messiah. And by putting this crown on Joshua's head, the significance is to reveal explicitly at this point. This is the explicit reveal that we know this from our perspective, but this was new information from their perspective. And that is when the branch will be crowned and he will rule over his people. He will rule not just as the king, but he will also rule as the high priest. Hence, the reason why the crown was placed on the head of Joshua, the current high priest. So this is the explicit reveal that when the Messiah comes and reigns, he will be the one who is both king and priest of his people. Now, we're told that this branch will build the temple of the Lord. This is another pretty interesting twist, because what's going on in that moment? They're building the temple of the Lord. It's almost completed. Zerubbabel and Joshua are right now leading in the building of the temple of the Lord. And we're also told that this crown that was constructed by Zechariah, or more likely that Zechariah probably paid somebody else to make it, but that this crown is going to end up sitting in this temple that is under construction while we're waiting for the branch and the Messiah, or the Messiah, to come. And so this means a couple of different things. The first thing that it means, as we've already said, Joshua the high priest is symbolizing the coming Messiah, who will be both the king of the Jewish people and the priest of the Jewish people. And then also by talking about the Messiah, the branch, building the temple, this is telling us that there is yet another temple that will be built by the branch. Now, there's been some debate throughout church history as the nature of this temple. The majority view throughout church history is that this is speaking of the church. The Messiah will build a new temple that will be the church, and he will sit and rule over a kingdom that is not of this world, but a spiritual kingdom that is the kingdom of heaven. Now, obviously, there's some language in the New Testament that can lend to that view. Paul speaks of our bodies being the temple of the Holy Spirit. And Jesus did tell Pilate right before his death that my kingdom is not of this world. And I think those are the reasons why this temple has been seen as the church. But I have a big problem with that view. And my problem with that view is that I don't think there's any way, from Zechariah's perspective or from the perspective of his contemporaries, that they would have thought in any way other than the fact that the branch or the Messiah would build another temple. I think all of the language here would point to them seeing that the Messiah is going to build another temple. All of the language points in that direction. And I do not like, and I think I'm always going to push very hard against the idea of reinterpreting prophecies to have a spiritual meaning that would not have been able to be guessed at, or you wouldn't have been able to come to in the day when the prophecy was originally given. I think if we make this prophecy refer to the body of Christ, I think that saps the power that this prophecy has. Because the significance of prophecy, the whole point of it is, it's God foretelling the future. It's God saying what's going to happen in future times and future days, because our God is the one God who knows the end from the beginning, who knows all things. And so all of a sudden, if you begin to reinterpret prophecy in such a way so that when it was originally given, the people who first heard it, it wouldn't make any sense to them what ended up happening, then what was the point of giving the prophecy in the first place? What does that say about how our God is distinguished from all other gods in his ability to know all things? So I believe for prophecy to be legitimate, it needs to make sense from the perspective of the original prophet and the original recipients. So this means that looking at the perspective of Zechariah and his generation, that we need to take this as the branch will build another temple. There will be a physical temple that will be built by the branch. We read here as well that this temple will be built by outsiders who will come into the land. I think this has the idea of the Jewish exiles around the world who will come in at the end of days. I think probably this could be a picture of the 144,000 Jewish believers who will end up being part of the building of the temple. But I think another reason to say why we need to have this as a physical temple that will be built by the Messiah one day is that we already have another physical temple in Old Testament prophecy that also has never been constructed, and that is the temple of the final chapters of Ezekiel. And so I think that we can pretty easily tie Zechariah 6 to the description of the temple at the end of Ezekiel and see the significance that one day there will be a king priest, and he will come and rule and reign over the Jewish people in Jerusalem. And when he does, he will build another temple, and that temple will be the final form, you could say, the final version of what Zerubbabel is building now. And I think one of the significance as well, by tying the Messianic temple to the temple of Haggai and Zechariah, is that I believe the millennial temple is going to serve as a sign of reward and a sign of tribute to the faithfulness of Zerubbabel and Haggai and this particular generation in their service to the Lord. We're going to be able to look back to the faithfulness of this day and what these people did in their service to God, because God doesn't forget his own who served him. And so even the small things will be rewarded by the Lord. And as I already mentioned, those who build the temple will be those who are afar off, according to verse 15. So finally, those Jews scattered by exile will come back home. Finally, we will have a time where Israel will celebrate the Passover, and they won't say next year in Jerusalem, but they'll be saying this year we are in Jerusalem, and they'll be celebrating it at this final temple, and they will be a singular people, and they will worship and proclaim the Lord as led by their king priest in glory. Now, one thing I want to make note of is the very last phrase. This is probably the one that could be the most difficult to interpret out of all of this chapter. And it says, and it will take place, and that is the coming of the Messiah, him being king and priest, the building of the final temple. It says this will take place if you completely obey the Lord your God. And so right here, Zechariah, through the message of the Lord, ties the coming of the Messiah to the obedience of God's people. Now, I'm one of those crazy people who believe that if Israel would have en masse turned to Jesus after his death and resurrection, if you would have had a repentance throughout the nation, from the highest in the priests to the lowest individuals of that nation, I think we would have skipped the whole church age. I think right there, Jesus would have been able to return and to establish his kingdom because his people would have obeyed him as a nation by believing in the Lord as the Son, and they would have received the kingdom right then and there. But sadly, they didn't. They rejected their Christ. They rejected the Messiah. We had a large number of Jews who were saved by faith early on in the church age, but even that large number, if you put it in the scope of all of the Jews around the world, it's still a small minority of the nation as a whole. But sadly, they rejected the Messiah. And one of the things we end up seeing in Romans 9 through 11 is that what is the benefit that we have because of the rejection of the Jews? Because of the rejection of the Jews, the gospel was able to go forth all throughout the world. We were able to have millions of Gentiles come to faith in Jesus Christ. But what does Paul also say in Romans 9 through 11? And that is, if their rejection brought forth us hearing the gospel, what do you think their acceptance will bring? Well, according to Zechariah chapter 6, what their acceptance will bring will be the Lord himself establishing the last temple in Jerusalem and his returning to rule over his people as both king and priest. And one of the things that we're seeing here in Zechariah chapter 6, and we're intended to see as a whole, is that when the Messiah comes to rule and reign, what will happen at his coming? But there will be a time of judgment. There will be a time of wrath upon the nations and those who reject him, and God's wrath will be appeased. It will be described later in the Bible, as we've already mentioned, as the time period of Armageddon. We need to remember earlier in Zechariah when we had the prophecy about the world being at peace, so that there was an open door for them to build the temple because no one was going to come and fight them in the midst of the construction. What was the reaction to this time of peace? It was, oh no, I can't believe we're having a time of peace, because that angel knew that that time of peace meant the Messiah could not come right now, because he knew a time of judgment would need to come first. So these all really tie really beautifully together, as if there was one grand God bringing the whole narrative together. And so we're looking forward to that day when the Jewish people as a whole will return to their Lord. I think that's the significance, the 144,000, 12,000 from each tribe in the midst of the tribulation, is telling us of that time period when the people will return and they will be faithful to the Lord. And then at that point, because his people have completely obeyed him in that time of tribulation, the Lord will come in judgment. The following end of that judgment will bring peace upon the earth, and then the king priest can establish his kingdom.